Hello everybody and welcome back to another tech tree overview, and in today's episode I'm going to go over the US battleships. First up, the South Carolina. The South Carolina, when fully upgraded, has 31,700 hit points, which is 7,000 hit points less than the Kawachee. However, in actual battles that difference isn't as apparent, and that primarily has to do with the range of the guns. The South Carolina, when fully upgraded, has 11.2 kilometer range. This compared to 9.8 on the Kawachee. On paper, that range increase doesn't seem like a big deal, but when you consider the fact that, let's say you're engaging a Tier 3 St. Louis, the South Carolina can engage the St. Louis outside of the St. Louis's range, allowing the South Carolina to get the first shot off. While in the Kawachee's case, it's going to close within the gun range of the St. Louis, take fire from that St. Louis, get within its own gun range, and then open fire, allowing that St. Louis to get a whole bunch of extra shots in. So that HP advantage that the Kawachee has, a lot of it's going to be spent closing that range, something the South Carolina doesn't really have to do. Another thing is that the South Carolina's gun placements, having two turrets pretty close together and two turrets pretty close together, seems to make the dispersion of the shells a little bit better at times. While in terms of the actual dispersion numbers, they look rather similar, it seems that when you're taking it into battle, the South Carolina just gets more consistent salvos. Although that could have just been, my RNG, I guess. But still, at least that's how I felt when I fired, that the South Carolina feels a little bit more consistent. The Kawachee's other advantage lies in the fact that it's a little bit faster. The Kawachee can go 20 knots versus the South Carolina's 18. But the fact that on the lower tiers the maps are a lot smaller, the speed difference really isn't all that apparent. The South Carolina also does turn a bit tighter, turning in 480 meters compared to the Kawachee's 560. This allows the South Carolina to wiggle a little bit more and dodge a little bit more shells. So that is an advantage. The South Carolina has a larger detection range, but still the gun range allows it to offset being spotted a little bit earlier. One major disadvantage I would say about the South Carolina is the fact that its superstructure is quite a bit bigger than the Kawachee, meaning that when enemy ships fire HE, more of them are likely to hit. So again, like I said, that range is going to help. It is going to allow you to stay away from some of the cruiser's shells, so that is a positive for the South Carolina. Overall, at Tier 3, I would say advantage South Carolina. The next ship on the USN Battleship line at Tier 4 is the Wyoming. Now, the Wyoming, again, has slightly less HP when fully upgraded when compared to the Japanese counterpart, having 43,800 HP when fully upgraded versus the 45,700 on the Miyogi. However, the Wyoming has substantially thicker citadel armor, which means that if you're angled a little bit, the Wyoming is definitely harder to citadel compared to the Miyogi. The Wyoming has less range on its guns, however, only 14.1 kilometer max range, while the Miyogi has 18.6 on its top hull, and it has a scout plane on top of that, which can increase its range quite a bit more. However, the Wyoming has its advantages for sure when it comes to firepower. Both it and the Miyogi have pretty dismal dispersion, and you're going to find that your shells have a tendency of shotgunning. However, the Wyoming has double the number of guns. While the Miyogi has larger caliber guns, the Wyoming has more of the lower caliber ones, which means that with the shotgun spread, you're still going to hit stuff with the Wyoming. And when you're in a Miyogi, you shotgun and you just watch your shells never hit anything at all. So in that sense, the poor dispersion on the Wyoming doesn't really hurt all that much, which is a big difference than the Miyogi, where poor dispersion hurts a lot. Both of them have pretty crappy AA, although the Miyogi's top hull is a little bit better. Speed on the Wyoming is obviously going to be less than the Miyogi, as it is a battleship versus a battle cruiser. The Wyoming goes 20.5 knots fully upgraded, while the Miyogi can go 28 knots fully upgraded. What's important on the Wyoming is that situational awareness is going to play quite a big role. If you're aware of what's going on in the battle and you can see things happening ahead of time, you can still react. But if you're reacting late, you're never going to get back with the Wyoming. The speed is just way too low. In terms of the turning circle, the Wyoming is tighter, 590 meters versus 730 on the Miyogi, and everything else is reasonably comparable. So, again, I would say at Tier 4, the Wyoming I think still has the advantage, namely because things at Tier 4 still not going to have the greatest range. Things at Tier 4 are still generally on smaller maps, where things like the number of shells you get in the air is going to help in that kind of engagement. So I would say at tier 3 and 4, the US battleships have the advantage. However, this early US advantage in battleships quickly fades when you get to tier 5, and that's because the Japanese battleships begin to dominate starting at tier 5 all the way to tier 10, with the exceptions of 6 and tier 9. So let's look at the New York. When you upgrade a New York fully, it's got 49,100 hit points, which is 5,000 less than what the Congo gets, because the Congo gets 54,100. Still, if you look at the raw armor numbers, you might say, well, the New York's armor seems to be better, as its citadel armor is thicker. True, but there's armor angling to take into account. And one of the problems with the New York is that its forward and aft end armor is only 19 millimeters. This means that a Congo can overmatch a New York's armor even when the New York is heavily angled. The same, however, cannot be said for the New York against the Congo, as the Congo's 25 millimeter armor at the forward and aft ends should allow it to bounce the shells from the New York when the Congo is heavily angled, thereby giving the Congo better armor overall when compared to the New York. Furthermore, the New York also has issues with range and dispersion. Its range, even when you upgrade it with the range module, only pushes up to 18.1 kilometers, while the Congo's range is at 21.2 when fully upgraded. Not only that, but the Congo, instead of having to get a range module, can get an accuracy module instead, giving it substantially better dispersion, thereby allowing it to land substantially more shells. The Wyoming's advantage compared to the Miyogi of having more guns doesn't really play out, considering the New York only has one additional turret over the Congo, and it's placed in the center with pretty bad arcs. So in order to use that one, you have to really turn almost full broadside, which means that the New York becomes much more vulnerable to Congo's shells. So in terms of that extra little bit of firepower advantage, again, not really present. One of the other big problems about the New York is the fact that it's still really slow, and the US battleships kind of stay slow all the way to tier 7. Only at tier 8 does the speed come back. The New York speed of 21 knots, which is not much more different from the Wyoming's, is a big deal, because at tier 5 the maps get bigger, and the fact that your ships is that much slower means you can't get around that quickly. Advantage massively shifts to the Congo, which can go at 30 knots. Still, I mean, the New York's still turns tightly, so against airplanes can't help, as you can turn more tightly into their torpedoes. Everything else about the two ships is reasonably similar, although I think the Congo still has a small edge when it comes to AA. At tier 5, definitely the edge is with the Congo. The two battleships that can be said to be the closest in terms of balance happens at tier 6, the New Mexico versus the Fuso. Both of these ships are pretty competitive against each other, and they each have their sort of own advantages and disadvantages. So let's take a look at the New Mexico, although I do have to say, if you get in New Mexico, make sure you do upgrade to the B hull as quickly as you can, as the B hull gives you new armor-piercing shells that do more damage and have better penetration. Anyways, when fully upgraded, the New Mexico has 53,200 hit points, while the Fuso has 57,100. The advantage the New Mexico has over the Fuso is it has thicker armor, so when the New Mexico is angled, it is definitely harder to penetrate compared to a Fuso. The advantage for the Fuso is, one, the HP, and second, its range. The Fuso still has the Japanese advantage of having a lot of range. When fully upgraded, it's got 21.8 kilometer range, and then it's still got that scalp plane. But the New Mexico's range isn't terrible. I mean, when you equip the range module to it, it's got 17.3 kilometer range, but unlike the New York, which even though it gets the range module and everything, it's stuck at 18.1, the New Mexico has a scalp plane, which can push its range to 20.76. Now, that number will come back to be relevant in a little bit, and I'll get back to it. So, at least when you get over 20 kilometer range, it's pretty comparable, as 20 kilometers is sort of the edge of where I think a battleship engagement should happen. And of course, at that range, even though the New York's dispersion is not as good as a Fuso's, you have 12 shells, which means you will hit stuff. So, gun-wise, pretty darn similar between the New Mexico and the Fuso. The advantage for anti-aircraft goes to the New Mexico, as its 40mm Bofors are more efficient than the 25mm guns on the Japanese battleship. Another thing about the New Mexico is that, again, very, very similar to the South Carolina, its turrets are closer together. And so I found that at times the New York's dispersion and everything, even though bad, it still somehow groups the shells a little bit closer together to each other, which is better, I think, at times than the Fusos, which are more spread out. However, the spread outness of the Fuso also has its advantages, because if you lose a turret on the New Mexico, you instantaneously lose 25% of your firepower compared to only 16% if you were in a Fuso and you lost a turret. So there's sort of pros and cons there as well. In terms of speed, the New Mexico retains the slow speed 21 knots that the American battleships have all the way to tier 7, while the Fuso is slower than the Congo, going 24.5. So between the two battleships, the speed, the Fuso is still faster, but not like by a massive margin that the Congo had over the New York. The New Mexico turns tighter at 640 meters compared to the Fuso's 740, and the New Mexico has better rudder shift time. So that does allow the New Mexico to sort of wiggle around more than the Fuso can. One interesting note about that scout plane range thing that I mentioned earlier deals with concealment. The concealment, while for a lot of other battleships not really substantial, plays a pretty important role with the New Mexico versus Fuso showdown, and that involves who gets first salvo. The New Mexico has 14.2 kilometer surface detection. The Fuso has 18.9. Now remember the thing about that scout plane. If the Fuso gets spotted by the New Mexico at 18.9, the New Mexico can pop up the scout plane and be able to get shots in on the Fuso, the first shot in. The Fuso, only after the New Mexico has shot, can get a reply salvo. So in this case, the New Mexico's lower surface detect is definitely an advantage over the higher surface detectability of the Fuso. There was one other thing I forgot to mention, and that was rate of fire. And in this case, the Fuso has the advantage. The New Mexico has a 1.8 round rate of fire compared to the Fuso's 2.1. However, in a direct Fuso versus New Mexico showdown, that rate of fire increase isn't as big as you think, and that's primarily because of the New Mexico's superior armor. If the New Mexico's well angled, a lot of the Fuso shells are just going to bounce. The only place where that rate of fire I think makes a big difference is if the Fuso is engaging things like cruisers. Then that increased rate of fire on the Fuso will play a pretty substantial role. But aside from that, I would say that the New Mexico and the Fuso are pretty well balanced against each other, and that at least at this particular tier, the US is pretty much on par with its Japanese counterparts, and in my personal opinion, the New Mexico is probably one of the best battleships on the US battleship line. And then in steps the Colorado, and while it's a better battleship now, it's still, in my opinion, not as good as what you'll get with the Nagato. First things first, again, like the New Mexico, once you get a Colorado, try to get the B-hull as quickly as possible. You get new shells, which have better penetration and do better damage. But aside from that, when you get a Colorado fully upgraded, its HP is almost 15,000 less than the Nagato. 50,100 versus 65,000 HP. They've tried to sort of compensate that by giving the Colorado a better heal. One that heals a little bit more of the damage that it takes and also heals, I guess, 5 HP per second more. So they've kind of tried to offset it, but it is not a massive difference in my personal opinion, as 15,000 more HP is still much better than just having a slightly better heal. Aside from that, however, the Colorado still has a lot of those typical US battleship traits, although it's gonna pay for them more now. First things first, its guns, poor range, but you're talking about poor range at tier 7, which means you can get up to tier 9 battles in a ship whose range, even when fully upgraded with the actual module, is only going to reach, what, 19.4 kilometers, and you're dealing with battleships that can easily surpass you. So the range kind of sucks, and then the dispersion at that range is terrifying. So the Colorado really is one of those ships you need to get up close with. So instead of getting that range, you might want to offer AA and try to make its AA really, really strong. It's just not very, very good in that regard. The guns are punchy. I mean, they are 406mm guns. They do punch hard, but the Nagato has 410mm guns, and they punch equally as hard, and they have better dispersion. So, yikes. The one thing that I think really stands out for me is the AA. and the fact that if you get really sort of up close, the armor angling potential is decent on the Colorado. So I mean, yeah, those are really its main advantages. Its speed is a pretty atrocious 21 knots, which again, once you get up to tiers 7, 8, 9, not very good at all. Turning circle is still tight at 640 meters, but its rudder shift time is pretty damn bad. 16.1 seconds compared to 13.7 on a Nagato. So the Colorado is just, it's a bit of a stinker on the USN line, and it's a ship that, you know, if you're going to play, you're really going to have to, you know, seek as much cover as possible from islands, get as close as possible, and then try to devastate stuff as quickly as you can with its guns. Aside from that, the Japanese counterpart is definitely superior to the ship, and if you've got an ability to try to skip it as quickly as possible, I would still recommend skipping the ship, as it is the low point on the USN line. However, things definitely start to improve once you get up to tier 8 and you get to the North Carolina. And the North Carolina is the first US battleship, first of all, that's not really damn slow, so that's a real plus. And it's like the minute you get into her, you're like, oh my god, I can go around the map quickly now, yay. Anyways, fully upgraded, the North Carolina has pretty similar HP to the Amagi, 66,000 compared to 66,300. The armor is pretty good, and especially when you go bow in, the North Carolina at tier 8 is very, very hard to penetrate, so that's really good. In fact, both the North Carolina and the Amagi, when angled, are really, really hard to kill, so that's a good thing. The North Carolina is also really good at going bow on because it maintains 66% of its firepower going bow on, compared to the Amagi, which only has 40% of its firepower when going bow in. So the North Carolina in that sense is pretty good. Also, range is good now. Once you get fully upgraded, 23.3 kilometer range, really nice. Amagi only has 19.9. AA on the North Carolina is fantastic, especially if you consider the fact that tier 8 planes really, really struggle against this ship. The AA right now doesn't seem to play as big of a role due to the lack of CVs, and you see that in ranked as well, as there's not a lot of CVs, and therefore the North Carolina is seen as being sort of the third tier battleship in ranked. However, in the future, when there's clan battles and CVs play a role, I think the North Carolina will definitely be an important ship then. And like I mentioned earlier, the speed is finally good, 27.5 knots. Still not like the Amagi's 30 knots, but 27.5 is a definite improvement over 21, and you can finally get around to places faster. The turn radius of 760 is excellent compared to the 870 on the Amagi. Rudder shift time is a little bit bad, 17.3 seconds, although the rudder shift module definitely helps. Surface detectability 15.7 is pretty good and allows you to get a little bit closer to actually hit stuff. The one big problem with the North Carolina, and I'll tell you this right now, the biggest problem with the North Carolina, dispersion. Biggest issue with US battleships, and it really, really starts to suck at the North Carolina, because you can fire salvos and just watch your shells go all over the place and not hit stuff. So that's one of the really, really frustrating things about the North Carolina. But again, the ability to go bow in and, you know, get closer and then use your guns does help. But still, I really would like to see that better dispersion on the US battleships. It would really make them just slightly better to play with. But of course, after you get through the North Carolina, which is a pretty decent ship, you get to what I think is the absolute pinnacle of US battleships, the tier 9 US battleship, the Iowa. The Iowa, in terms of HP, finally is a little bit better than the Japanese tier 9, 79,000 HP versus 78,900. So yay, US finally has the HP advantage. Hurrah. When angled, the Iowa is solid. When bow in, it's pretty solid as well. Its range, 23.3 kilometers, is great. It's got the 406 millimeter Mark 8 shells, which have pretty decent penetration. The range is better than what the Izumo has, which is 21.7. The damage on the shells for the Iowa is really, really nice, and the dispersion is better than the North Carolina, because on the Iowa you can actually equip an accuracy module, so yay, you know, at least the shells are going to actually hit stuff. I definitely found that the Iowa's dispersion was just better than the North Carolina. Perfect. And not only that, the Iowa I think is better than the Izumo because its gun placement is better. It's more like a traditional battleship. It's also weird. Just a better ship than the Japanese tier 9 counterpart. The Japanese tier 9 counterpart, one on paper, seems to have better dispersion numbers. I didn't feel that in battle. I just felt that the Iowa was more consistent with its shells. The AA again on the Iowa was fantastic, and The Iowa's fast, really, really fast, 30.5 knots, and that gives it an advantage over pretty much every other battleship, I think, except the Tirpitz. So, yay for Iowa there. Turning radius, however, starts to get pretty big, 920 meters, and the Stockhol's rudder shift is brutal. But then again, the Japanese Izumo turns like a brick too, so both of these battleships, I guess, can go under that category, turns like bricks on water. The Iowa's detectability, however, is better, 16.2 compared to the ridiculous 19.3 on the Izumo. So I think that if you're playing the U.S. battleship and you're grinding this line, you get to tier 9, you get to the Iowa, stop here. This is the absolute pinnacle of U.S. battleships. And even if you take an Iowa into a tier 10 battle and you run into a Yamato, she still has ways of fighting the Yamato. And that is primarily the case because she is faster. And when she's bow on, she has a narrower profile. So if you're playing US battleships, you get to Iowa, stop. Do not sell it. Do not trade it for Montana. And that's because the Montana is... it's one of those ships you go, oh boy, why did you put this at tier 10? Because she has like certain advantages over the Iowa, but when she goes up against the Yamato, she has issues, major issues. So let's kind of go over the Montana real quickly, and I'll explain to you what those problems are. One, the big problem is when she runs into Yamato and she goes bow on, she's big. She's bigger than the Iowa. She's got this wider profile, which makes it easier for the Montana to take hits from a Yamato. The Iowa, which has a narrower profile, is going to take less shells. So in that sense, the Iowa is going to be safer just because she's a bit narrower. The Montana's, obviously it's got more HP, 96,300 and everything. The armor is the issue. The Montana's bow armor, 32 millimeters, is overmatched by the Yamato's 460 millimeter guns, but the Montana's guns cannot overmatch the Yamato's. So that means that when you're fighting a Yamato as a Montana, you gotta get to its side. But this is made really hard by the fact that the Montana only goes 28 knots, which is 1 knot faster than the Yamato. The Iowa, which can go 30.5, finds it easier to use that speed to get into more advantageous positions. So in that sense, the Montana is not as good as an Iowa. Furthermore, the rudder shift time on the Montana really slow, 22.2 seconds. That's not good. The surface detectability is higher at 17.8. The only real advantage of the Montana is the extra turret and the fact that it's got slightly better AA over the Iowa, and that really isn't worth it all that much, especially considering at tier 10 you're guaranteed to see other tier 10 battleships, most notably Yamatos, like all the time. So the Montana really struggles, and it's not an improvement over an Iowa, and I find that if you're in an Iowa, you actually have a better chance. The only real ways of setting up the Montana that I found efficient is one, build for full concealment, so get as stealthy as possible. That gives you a chance to outflank and get into better positions. And two, there's two ways of getting the third module on the guns. One, you go for better accuracy, which helps if you happen to try to land that good hit against Yamato when you get into position. Also helps when you're trying to land, I guess, longer range Citadel hits against cruisers. However, if you're trying to just get really up close and personal and just trying to sneak around and stuff, the other way I found that you can build the Montana is to build it for rate of fire at the expense of turret traverse. The Montana already has pretty decent turret traverse, so if you sacrifice it, it's not really that big of a deal. But that extra rate of fire can allow you to output more shells and thereby more damage. And especially when you're constantly trying to fight stuff, that extra little bit of rate of fire can be beneficial, as you are able to catch things by surprise, especially cruisers that are expecting a 30-second reload timer, and in fact you're able to get out shells in like 26. So I would say that is my recommendation for the Montana. Do make sure you get that. And of course, yeah, there's one other thing to talk about, is the fact that the Montana's heal repair kit is just like substantially worse than the Yamato. So, all in all, stay at the Iowa. Just don't sell the Iowa to trade up for a Montana. It's not worth it. And the tier 10 is just a major disappointment on the USN Battleship line. Anyways, folks, I hope this tech overview has helped. I hopefully, I've shown you what you're going to be coming across and giving you a pretty good idea of what the US Battleship line is going to have in store for you. If you have any questions, do make sure you leave them in the comment section below. Aside from all that, you all have a good week, and I will talk to you all again soon.